Hey, good afternoon. So I want to talk about cyberwar, but I guess not in the way that most people do. I want to talk about the phenomenon of cyberwar, where it's coming from, what it actually means, and why I think it's important. So cyberwar has been, it's been a trope for a few years, 3 to 4. And last June, about a year and a quarter ago, I participated in a debate on cyberwar in the United States. And it was an actual debate. I'd never done this before. Right? There were sides. There was winning. The proposition of the debate was the threat of cyberwar has been grossly exaggerated. I was on the side of yes, it's been grossly exaggerated. The two people were on the side of no, it is not. And the way the debate worked, the way they decided who won, is they polled the audience at the beginning of the debate as to whether they agreed or disagreed with the proposition, polled the audience at the end of the debate, and the side that changed the most minds won. I thought this would be a cakewalk, right? I would show up with a list of gross cyberwar exaggerations, we'd all vote, and we'd go home. As it turns out, I lost that debate. At the end of the hour, I failed to convince the audience that the threat of cyberwar has been grossly exaggerated. And it really wasn't until after that, really thinking about what happened in the debate, the discussion, and the voting, that I really came to understand, what the phenomenon of cyberwar actually is. So I had some great exaggerations. I had Mike McConnell, who used to run the NSA, now he's a contractor at Booz Allen Hamilton, say in a Washington Post editorial, "The United States is fighting a cyber war today and we're losing." Right? The U.S. is currently at war. I had a U.S. senator talk about "We risk cyber Katrina." A headline from the Miami Herald, "Cuba capable of raging cyber war." I had a headline from the Australian newspaper The Independent that said, "Hackers declare cyber war on Australia." Right? Cyber war is so easy, even kids can do it. Amit Yoran was the U.S. National Cybersecurity Advisor under President Bush, the second one after Richard Clarke. He wrote, "Cyber 9/11 has happened over the last 10 years, but it's happened slowly so we don't see it." I don't even know what that means. Newspaper headlines, "Germany attacks China for starting a cyber war." "China declares war on Western search sites." You can declare cyber war on companies, presumably. "Cyber war declared as China hunts for the West's intelligence secrets." Wall Street Journal, "Cyber blitz hits U.S. Korea." So I had cyber war, cyber Katrina, cyber blitz, cyber 9/11. I found cyber Pearl Harbor. My favorite was cyber Armageddon. Right? This is what gross exaggeration looks like. And when you read about cyber war, there's one incident that usually comes up to the top as example of the first cyber war, and that was Estonia. So in April 2007, there were a series of denial of service attacks against government and commercial sites in Estonia. They were not, as the popular press wrote at the time, unprecedented, on a scale never seen before. They were kind of regular denial of service attacks. And because this was at a time of ethnic tensions between Estonia and Russia, Russia was blamed for launching these attacks. And it'll be common through all these examples. We pretty much never know who did it. So Russia has never admitted doing it. And to this day, we don't know if it was government-sponsored, government-tolerated, what I think of as kids playing politics, like some of the hacktivism we sort of talked about earlier. And in fact, the only person ever convicted of these denial of service attacks was a 22-year-old ethnic Russian living in Tallinn who was personally annoyed about a statue being pulled down. So perhaps cyberwar is so easy, even kids can do it. As war goes, it's kind of a weird thing, right? This is a denial of service attack. So it's like the enemy army invades your beaches, runs onto your shores, and all gets in front of the line from you at the post office. Right? Not really what we think of as war. Another example, also in 2007 in Brazil. This was the lead cyber war example in 60 Minutes. It's a U.S. news magazine. They're a big expert on cyber war. In 2007, there were a series of blackouts in the country that had been blamed on extortionists. Right? The idea was that the cyber attackers figured out how to penetrate the power system networks, perhaps the SCADA systems, we have no idea, and threatened to turn off the power unless they were paid, and they demonstrated this. This is all speculation. The Wired reported on a report that said it was dirt in the insulators that caused the power outages, not cyber attacks at all, but that's often used as an example. 2008 in Georgia, there was another series of denial of service attacks, very similar to Estonia. The difference was this actually precipitated a real live land attack, right? Russian tanks and troops driving into Georgia. And before that were a series of denial of service attacks. Again, we don't know if they were government-sponsored or just hacktivists. All right, so as becomes sort of clear in these few examples, and became really clear in the debate, is one of the problems we have is there's no good definition of war in cyberspace. Right? We don't know what it means for there to be a cyber war. We don't know when it starts. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know how to tell when it's over. Right? And it's not just newspaper headline writers and politicians. Right? Cybersecurity experts, military theory experts don't have agreement on these things. Right? And that makes discussing this very difficult. I mean, it's clear we're not at actual war. Right? The statement that the United States is fighting a cyber war today is obviously false. And there's an interesting phenomenon which I think is causing a problem here. I don't know about here, in the United States at least, we hate using the word war when there's an actual war. We'll do anything to call it not a war. But we love using the word war when there isn't a war. We like rhetorical wars. War on terror, war on crime, war on drugs, war on poverty. Right? And what cyber war is right now is a combination of a rhetorical war. I mean, a lot of those headlines, a lot of those statements were rhetorical war statements with actual, war stuff. And that also makes this conversation very difficult because people don't know what they're talking about. Is cyber war like the war on poverty? Or is it like Iraq? Well, it's kind of like some of each. And that's not good because it's confusing. All right, I mean, what's going on, and I guess if there's a central point in this talk, it's right here. It's not that we're fighting a cyber war. It's that we're increasingly seeing warlike tactics used in broader cyber conflicts. Right? In the real world, it's easy to tell when you're at war. If you look down the street and you see a tank, that means war. Because only governments can afford tanks. Right? If you see a bomber, that's war. Nobody else bombs you. In cyberspace, it's different. You can't tell what's going on by looking at the weaponry or looking at the tactics. Everybody uses denial of service attacks. Everyone uses sabotage attacks. Everyone uses the same vulnerabilities against the same systems. Right? Technology is broadly spreading capability, so the same things are being used by the hacktivists and by the militaries. Right? Stuxnet was done by a military. It's an internet worm. I mean, it's a good one, but it's still a worm. When it showed up, nobody had any idea who did it. And that, again, makes this hard. Right? So some more examples of these broader cyber conflicts and what's going on. GhostNet, discovered in March of 2009. This is a very complex, sophisticated surveillance network. Discovered by researchers who were cleaning out the Dalai Lama's computers. And following it back, it attacked political, media, and corporate targets about 100 countries. And again, in like all of these incidents, we never know who does it. So we look at the victim and backtrack who the perpetrator is. The list of targets read like a who's who of who China wants to spy on. So, uniformly believe that China was behind this. July of 2009, there were attacks in the United States and South Korea, denial of service attacks. Again, you look at who the victims are. It was obviously North Korea. And there was at least one U.S. lawmaker that said we should strike back kinetically. We should fire missiles back at the country that did this. When more research was done, the attacks emanated from either China, London, or Florida, which if striking back would have been awkward if it were Florida, or London. January of 2010, Google announced that it was the victim of some very sophisticated, large-scale attacks against Gmail users, primarily Chinese dissidents. Again, we assume China is involved. There's a lot of attacks emanating from China. Those who pay attention believe that it's less that they are state-sponsored and more that they're state-tolerated. So it's independent groups operating within China who operate with impunity and know if they find something good, they should pass it on to their handlers. So that seems to be mostly what's going on, although there's a lot of government-sponsored stuff out of China, it's believed. Stuxnet, Jim already talked about Stuxnet. I mean, really, it's the first military-grade cyber weapon we've ever seen, and it's worth reading about. We know a lot through investigative journalism. It attacked a nuclear power plant in Iran, written by Israel and the US, extensively tested, extremely well designed. If we want to add to this notion of broad cyber attacks, in the last 3 election cycles in the United States, we've seen attacks against candidates and parties' websites. Again, these are never done by the opposing candidate or the opposing party. It's always some individual trying to help by doing damage. I always think of this as kids playing politics, the hacktivists. You heard a lot about Anonymous. They're an interesting group. We watched them basically take down H.B. Gary. H.B. Gary was a cybersecurity company that was owned pretty severely by the hacker group Anonymous. That's not supposed to happen. We learned in the documents that were released that H.B. Gary was, among other things, built cyber weapons for the United States. I didn't even know we had cyber weapons arms manufacturers. But, of course, where we have one, we have more than one. So, when you think about defense in cyberspace, I got my clock back. When you're attacked in cyberspace, there are any number of institutions you can call on to defend yourself. Right? You can call on the police. You can call on the military. You can call on whatever group does counterterrorism in your country. You can call on a set of commercial products and services. You can call on your corporate lawyers. Right? And those are all valid responses. And the legal framework in which your defense operates, right, which option you choose, depends on 2 things: who's attacking you and why. And in cyberspace, when you're being attacked, the very 2 things you don't know are who's attacking you and why. Right? And that makes defense difficult. If you're the victim of a denial of service attack, you don't know whether you should call the police or call the military or deal with it yourself. And again, it's this democratization of tactics and weaponry. If everyone uses the same stuff, you don't know who to call. When we see a tank, we know to call the military. We don't call the constable. If we're mugged, we don't call the army. But in cyberspace, you don't have that clean demarcation. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of policy debates that are kind of going haywire. Because every group in defense, right, whether it's the military, the police, or in the US it's Homeland Security, looks at the large and sees their job bigger and overlapping everybody else. Right, some of the tactics, data theft, eavesdropping. Sort of think of all the examples I went through: data manipulation, denial of service, sabotage. Right, so a lot of this, I think, falls under the rubric of APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. Now, like Jim, I don't know if he's still here. There he is. I hated that term for years. It's a buzzword. It's a marketing term. It's there to sell you stuff. But I actually have come around. I think it has value. And I think it has value because it describes a threat that's different than the threat we've been dealing with or thinking about over the past several years. The normal criminal threat, it tends to be opportunistic. Right? The criminals want 1,000 credit card numbers. They want to commit fraud. Whatever their goals are, they don't necessarily want you. So your security is actually best measured relative to everybody else. If your security is better than your peers, then the bad guys will go after them and not you. And that's true for a lot of hacking, for a lot of traditional threats. An APT is targeted. For whatever reason, the attacker wants you. And against that kind of attacker, your security has to be measured absolutely. It doesn't matter how good you are relative to your neighbors. It's, are you good enough to keep the bad guy out? Right? You know, and traditionally, an advanced persistent threat is better funded, more sophisticated, slower, more methodical. You know, and unfortunately, in computer security today, the attacker has the advantage. You know, against a sufficiently well-funded, motivated adversary, they're going to get in wherever they want. I mean, that's just the way the internet works these days. Right? The attacker has the advantage. So I think of this as politically motivated hacking. And by politics, I mean something very broad. Right? It could be nationalistic, it could be ethical, it could be religious. Right? It could be a raid against governments, against corporations, institutions, individuals. Right? You think of companies in politically charged industries, you know, or let's say Microsoft, a company people love to hate. Could be companies in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, last year Sony just became, because of where they were, they became the whipping boy for security. That, you know, it became the thing to attack Sony. Not for any particular reason, they just happen to get stuck in that position. Right? Or companies who are attacked because of what they did in response to WikiLeaks. Right? These are very different than a criminal who just wants, you know, who wants the goods, and it doesn't matter where the goods come from. So there's a lot of politics here. I mean, this is really more politics than computer security. I mean, the world is gearing up for cyberwar. I believe we're in the early years of a cyberwar arms race. And it's, you know, it's the U.S. We learned in, I think, October of last year that the U.S. Cyber Command is fully operational. We don't know what that means, but we've been assured it's true. UK has talked a lot about cyberwar. NATO. China has for over a decade talked very publicly, you know, written papers about the need to dominate militarily in cyberspace. How cyberspace will evolve as a theater of war during an actual war. I mean, not during these little things we just talked about, but during a real war. You know, what happens in cyberspace? Right? Because any war will expand to fill all available theaters. So it's just like you have land, sea, air, space. In the future we'll have cyberspace. We're seeing power struggles within governments over this sort of new domain. Who gets the budget? Who gets the power? Generally, it's between you know, the police and the military. In the United States, it was a three-way battle between the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense over, you know, this cyber war and these broad political cyber threats. Who is going to be in charge of defense? We kind of know who won because the general in charge of the U.S. Cyber Command is General Keith Alexander, who's also in charge of the National Security Agency. Right? And the U.S. Cyber Command is located at Fort Meade, which just happens to be where the National Security Agency is located. Right? So that's where the cyber capabilities in the United States are. And why I think this is important is that the metaphor matters a lot. Right? To the police, we are citizens to protect. To the military, we're a population to be subdued. And when you start talking about internet policy in terms of war, in terms of cyber war, you get different solutions. Right? A different set of solutions present themselves and seem plausible if you talk about war than if you talk about crime. And we're seeing this play out in a lot of different debates in different countries around the world. We're seeing debates basically about military control of parts of the internet. Right? The argument is that there are pieces of the net that are so important that they must be the security must be under control of the military. In the U.S., we've heard this about the national power grid and about the internet backbone. I mean, so far, control has not passed to the military. But in a war situation, that'd be a reasonable thing to do. Right? And if we are, like Mike McConnell says, currently in the middle of a cyber war and we're losing, drastic times call for drastic measures. We saw this debate about when the notion of wholesale surveillance became public, that we learned in the United States that the National Security Agency was eavesdropping on everybody. Right? And in peacetime, if in the United States the FBI or someone else went to AT&T and said, we'd like to eavesdrop on everybody, AT&T would say, okay, show me your warrant. As opposed to what happened was where AT&T said, okay, use that closet over there, close the door when you're done, and don't mark the door. Right? But that was in the year after September 11th. There was very much a feeling that we are a nation at war. Right? You're seeing this debate in the different skirmishes about eavesdropping facilitation. I have two examples of that. One is from America. We traditionally, so I'll go back in time. Traditionally, when the police wanted to eavesdrop on a phone call, they would go to the phone switch and show their warrant, be led into the big mechanical room with all the switches and wires, and they'd plug their eavesdropping equipment onto the phone line they'd listen on, and have a pair of headphones and a recorder, and they would eavesdrop. And that's the way it was done. Right? When packet-switched phone networks came into to popularity, the FBI was no longer able to do that. Right? There wasn't the place to eavesdrop. The phone calls weren't really separate until the local loop, which could be a big box on a street corner somewhere. And it's a bit conspicuous to eavesdrop there. So the FBI went to the phone companies and said, hey, fix this. And the phone companies said, look, we can't. This is the new equipment. This is the way it works. We're sorry. The FBI got a little pouty. They went to Congress and said, pass a law, make them fix that. And that's what happened. The law is called CALEA, which stands for, I forget, Communications Something Assistance with Law Enforcement. But basically the law says that the phone companies must make their phone switches eavesdropping capable to allow the FBI to listen in. I mean, fast forward to today, and quite a lot of communications is not happening over phone networks. And the FBI is going back to Congress, and these are bills that are discussed that we haven't had this voted on, to force communications providers to make all of their systems eavesdropping ready. And the law's written very broadly. The real problem is obviously, a real problem is Skype. Right? People are making phone calls over Skype. Skype is encrypted. The FBI can't eavesdrop. That annoys them. Now, this law, if you think about it, will be, depending on your system, either easy or impossible to implement. Right? Easy would be, Gmail. Right? Google released statistics, a couple months ago on the number of requests for customer data they receive from law enforcement from various countries and how often they comply. It's actually fascinating data. You should look it up. Right? But your mail exists on Google servers in the clear. It's trivially easy to give whatever they have to the police. On the other end here is Skype. Right? Skype is end-to-end encrypted from your computer to whoever you're talking to's computer, and there's no central space in the middle to eavesdrop. You'd have to completely rip the system apart and design it inferiorly to make it eavesdropping capable. And the middle is everything else. I mean, the way the laws the way the bills are written, it would cover everything from SMS and chat to Second Life and the little window in your poker program where you insult your other players. I mean, that would all be covered under this law, right? Any communication system. And again, whether we are a nation at war or at peace will determine how people vote on measures like this. Now, we also saw this facilitation debate last year with RIM. Last year, the governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates both complained to RIM that they were unable to eavesdrop on BlackBerries in their country, and that annoyed them. And would RIM please make their BlackBerries more eavesdropping friendly? RIM said, no, we can't do that. That's not the way systems are designed. The government said, that's nonsense. You did it for Russia. You did it for China. You should do it for us. India popped up and said, yeah, we want that too. Right? And we had a few months of sort of tense negotiations where RIM threatened to pull out of countries, and a lot of things happened. At the end, we learned that RIM reached arrangements with these countries so they could stay. We kind of all know what that means, right? Basically, they put a RIM server within the country's borders, and then that allowed whatever local law enforcement to do whatever they could do under their law or power or whatever. Right? But again, another debate on making systems eavesdropping friendly. We're seeing debates on data retention. Many countries in Europe now have data retention laws that force ISPs to keep the data on their customers, browsing habits and messages, for 6 months, a year, 2 years, depending on the law. And this again is so that law enforcement can eavesdrop on them, backwards in time. Tell me what he was doing last month. Last year, we had a debate in the United States about the internet kill switch. This takes a lot of forms. I like to think of it as a big red button on Obama's desk. But that's the basic idea, right? Give the president the option to shut off the internet. I'm not sure if it's just our internet or your internet too. I mean, maybe we could shut off the entire planet's internet if he wants to in an emergency. As a security guy, I tell you this is a crazy idea. I mean, right now, we cannot build such a button. We have to redesign the net to be able to build it. And once you put in the capability of this button, now we have to make sure only the good guys can press it, which is an extraordinarily hard problem. So we're all safer if no such button exists. Right? But again, depending on how the debate goes, whether we are at war, whether we're at peace, whether it's criminals, whether it's militaries, we're going to get a different answer when that comes up to vote. Right? And finally, at the various debates about attribution. Every few years we see proposals to eliminate anonymity. The basic argument is if only we knew who everybody was, all the bad things would go away. Right? Not only one, will this not work, two, it's impossible. We cannot build anonymity out of the internet. And I mean, there are any number of papers that show that even in a fully non-anonymous system, you could build anonymity on top of it. So, we can't make this work. But it's another debate I think is colored by the cyberwar rhetoric. Some of these things might make sense in wartime, but they really do all make us less safe in peacetime. All right, so a couple of closing points. One, I'm not saying that cyberwar will never exist. I think we do need to be prepared for cyberwar, and a U.S. Cyber Command is just as reasonable as a U.S. Navy, because war will expand to fill all available theaters. The discussion on who controls critical infrastructure, I think, is important to have. There is a level of security we need that markets cannot achieve, simply because of the externalities and the way the risks flow. And in those instances, the only way to get that security is for government to step in. I like seeing articles and papers in military journals on cyberwar, because there's some interesting characteristics of cyberwar. Right? There's a fundamental asymmetry between attack and defense. There's a notion of terrain in cyberspace. Think of a country like North Korea with, 7 computers. They're pretty much invulnerable to a cyber attack. Right? As opposed to the US or the UK with all sorts of computers doing critical things, we're more vulnerable. Right? There's this real problem of anonymity. Weapons don't come with return addresses. If some country bombs you, you could look up in the sky and see the flag painted on the tails of the planes. But you can't do that in cyberspace. It's a lot of discussion. I think it's real important. Wow. I'm out of time. But I'm going to finish. A lot of discussion on cyberwar treaties. I think this is real important. There's a book I actually hesitate to recommend, written by Richard Clarke. It's called Cyberwar. The first half of the book is about cyberwar exaggerations, and it's terrible. Don't read it. The second half of the book is about cyberwar treaties, and it's fantastic. You should all read it. See, it's hard. And he spends a lot of time comparing cyberwar treaties to nuclear and chemical treaties. And he's had experience in these treaties. And he talks about where these treaties might be negotiated, what international organizational bodies might negotiate them, how they might look, how they might be enforced. Enforcement's a real issue here. Right? We've learned how easy it is to hide a chemical weapons plant. You can imagine how easy it is to hide a cyber weapons plant. Right? And he has some good ideas of what treaties might look like. Right? No first use of weapons, minimization of collateral damage, no attacks against civilian targets and infrastructure, no unaimed weapons. Weapons need to self-destruct at the end of a conflict. Stuxnet will self-destruct next April. Very polite of it. The kind of thing you might embed in a treaty. Again, verification, something real important needs to be discussed. For the large part, the United States is blocking efforts on cyberwar treaties. I think there's a belief that we somehow have some advantage you want to exploit. I think even a cyber command hotline would be a good idea between the various countries' cyber commands. Right? Because we have a very big problem of non-state actors. And I think it's very destabilizing when you're attacked and you don't know if it's a country doing it or some guy in a country doing it. It's a weird world. Last year, the hacker group Anonymous told NATO not to mess with it. Right? We shouldn't be living in a world where a bunch of guys can threaten NATO. Right? That's just plain weird. So the more communications when things get weird, the better. We need to discuss what level of command should be making these decisions. For us in this room, I think we start thinking about commandeering. Because I assure you, if the U.S. is engaged in a cyber war, it's not going to use computers in Fort Meade or Fort Huachuca. It's going to use Google. Right? You're going to see civilian networks commandeered for military purposes when that matters. And lastly, we need to understand cyber mercenaries. A lot of this is happening by civilians, by third parties. And what does that mean? And I've already mentioned non-state actors. Mostly, I think we need to stop feeding our fears. There's a lot of cyber war rhetoric, and it's getting people scared, and it's getting people scared because there is profit in scared people. There's a lot of money here. The cyber war arms race is going to be very expensive. And companies are jockeying for contracts, for power. And while I think a reasoned discussion is important, we need to keep it reasoned. So that's my talk. I think there are going to be questions now.
There are. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Someone who knows.
Terrific.